CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Brazil is back, so says President Lula da Silva as he tours the Chinese financial hub of Shanghai during his state visit.
Our other headlines: China's exports unexpectedly rose last month, shooting up almost 15% from a year ago. We'll be finding out what's behind this increase.
Pensions protests in Paris, another day of strikes across France. Luxury brand LVMH is targeted by demonstrators.
And the woman who dressed the world in miniskirts, the fashion designer Mary Quant, has died at the age of 93. Brazil is back, so says President Lula da Silva, visiting China's financial hub of Shanghai as part of his state visit to the country.
He's seeking to boost trade ties with China and reposition Brazil as a global player. Lula attended the official swearing-in of close advisor and former Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff as head of the new development bank. The bank's been set up by the BRICS economies of Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Paulo Cabral in Sao Paulo. So how is this visit being viewed by Brazilians?
Well, Brazilians are paying a lot of attention to this visit. Actually, it's all over Brazilian media, be it TV, print, online, or even social media. It is a topic of discussion here in Brazil. And Brazilians are, in general, very much aware of the importance of China in today's world, of the growing importance of this country as an investor, as a trade destination, and also as an exporter of goods. So there is much attention to what the relations between Brazil and China will be. In the previous government of Jair Bolsonaro, we did see the president often criticizing China many times with harsh words, even though trade between the two countries was growing. This was something that was not very popular in Brazil, apart from those that had really strong ideological allegiances to President Bolsonaro. These critics of China were usually badly seen by the business community in Brazil, for example, that knew how important it was to do business with China. So for Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, this visit has a great importance just after he completed 100 days in government, both for a practical reason. He does need Chinese investment in Brazil, does need to increase trade with China for Brazilian economy to grow and grow in a sustainable way, and also symbolical as trying to search this statesman stature that Lula da Silva did have in the two first governments in the early and end of 2000s.
So what has President Lula been doing to promote China-Brazil ties?
Well, look, first he went with a large delegation of about 250 members of the business community, not counting another 50 government officials or so that do want to diversify trade with China. This is one of the things that the Brazilian government is pushing for. Nowadays, most of the trade with China is based on some major commodities from Brazil like iron ore, beef and soybeans, and Brazilian exporters want to diversify their exports to China. And there is also much interest in investment from China. Brazil badly needs investment in infrastructure, particularly transports with roads, railways, ports, and also in energy. And this has to do even with the capacity of Brazil to increase its production and increase also its capacity to export, which is very much also in the interest of China, which is Brazil's main customer. So this is what President Lula, the message that President Lula is taking to China, that Brazil is open for business with China, and in practical terms they have about 20 bilateral agreements that are to be signed and that hopefully will have impact in the near and long terms.
Paulo, thank you very much. My correspondent Paulo Cabral in Sao Paulo.
China's exports unexpectedly rose last month, shooting up 14.8% from a year ago. The forecasters had predicted a 7% fall. Analysts say this surge is likely due to suppliers catching up with unfulfilled orders from the COVID pandemic. Imports fell less than expected, dropping 1.5% rather than the 5% estimated. Well, Dan Wang is chief economist at Hang Seng Bank, China.
Those numbers are a bit hard to explain, but if we look at different sectors, the new energy sector has been performing the best, both in export and in import. But in import, it's mostly about industrial inputs and raw materials, and in export, it's mostly about the new energy products in solar and wind, and as well as the new energy vehicles. And if we look at different destinations, thus ASEAN countries have been holding up quite well in their import from China. And the European market has been coming back from the first 2 months of contraction, and their import from China turned positive in March, and that's also good news. And the export to Russia had surged in March as well. But since Russian trade is only about 5% of China's total export, so the surge to Russia in export only contribute to about 2 percentage points of China's total export growth.
What do these numbers mean for the wider economy as the country aims to stimulate growth and shake off the pandemic?
Well, if the export figures can hold up like this for the rest of the year, China would not only reach its 5% of GDP target, but also very likely to exceed about 5.5%. The domestic demand remain weak in China, especially in housing and consumption, so the export will be a major support for the domestic manufacturing sector.
And what policies would help boost the economy further?
The number one priority for the Chinese government is to restore the confidence in the domestic market, especially in the housing market. It will determine whether Chinese economy can have a true recovery this year. The housing transaction have returned to positive finally in the last week in March, but we don't know if this growth can be sustainable. People are still hesitant to get back into the housing market, partially because they're worried about economic prospects, but also partially because they're hoping to see maybe the property tax will come in a year or two. So overall, the government has to make it more clear that they're keen to boost economic growth. The macroeconomic policy, especially the monetary policy, needs to be more aggressive than what we have now.
And what other key economic data should we be watching out for in the coming weeks and months?
In the coming month or two, I'd be watching with great interest about the monetary policy, whether the central bank would lower interest rate. That's number one. And then I will be checking the new home sales price. Because the new home sales is a good indicator for the housing investment in the months to come. Right now, it has been pretty weak. And then lastly, I will be keeping an eye on the retail market, especially the retail in the small cities. Because in large cities, people have better job security, so their consumption has been holding up relatively well. But smaller cities have been lagging.
Homegrown high-end brands are taking centre stage on the catwalk. It's Fashion Week at the China International Consumer Products Expo. CGTN's correspondent Huang Fei reports.
What does the wardrobe of someone in the top echelon of modern high society look like? Well, Grace Chen's opening show at the Hainan Expo Fashion Week may be the closest I can get to an answer. Known as the power dresser of China, Grace Chen's clientele has included some of the most influential people in the world of business, politics, and even international royalty. Chinese literature and art has had a big influence on her creations. But what will it take to establish China's fashion identity and for it to command global attention?
What I've done today is to interpret the traditional culture into people's life today. What people might be thinking or liked in Song Dynasty, if they live in today, what that could be. I think it's really totally transcend race or geography or time.
For a renowned designer who has already presented on some of the biggest runways in the world, this duty-free mall in Haikou may seem like an odd choice. But this week's shows are just as much about fashion diplomacy as they are about business.
The high-end brands that have converged on the tropical island this week have a common goal: to catch the attention of the world's second-largest luxury market. Despite a sales slump last year during COVID restrictions, China's luxury consumption is expected to recover this year. And by 2030, the number of middle and high-income consumers in the country could double.
I think homegrown high-end label is really been in calling for a long time. However, fashion is not something easy to do. A premier fashion brand means you have to have your own philosophy behind it. You are not following any trends.
China's fashionistas are increasingly discerning with a diverse set of tastes, which makes the job of a buyer more challenging. Grace Liu is searching for new designs that could sell in a high-end luxury shop in Hainan.
In the past, people had similar tastes in fashion, but now everybody has their own distinct style. So I need to keep looking for something new. For example, Chinese chic and the more avant-garde designs seem to be very popular.
For many years, European and American fashion houses represented the pinnacle of luxury for Chinese consumers. But now a cultural and aesthetic shift is taking place. International brands are now taking cues from Chinese designers and consumers. It is as if we've gone full circle. Ancient China was famous for its refined clothing and jewelry. And today's silk pieces show how craftsmanship and innovation are the very heart of China's own fashion identity. Huangbei, CGTN, Haikou in Hainan Province.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, secrets and spies. What are we learning about the classified United States intelligence documents leaked online?
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliette Mann.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. Questions are continuing over the source of the alleged leak of those highly classified United States intelligence files.
The latest revelations suggest that Washington has been closely monitoring United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres and believes he's too willing to accommodate Russian interests. A number of documents relate to the conflict in Ukraine. The US Justice Department has opened a criminal investigation, and there are reports that the leak came from a man who works on a military base. Well, our correspondent Yolo Abdavid is following the story. So what do we know about this alleged leaker?
We know far more after the Washington Post newspaper interviewed two members of the online chat group that this person called OG, which stands as an alias for Original Gangster. So a lot of this information has been shared in a 6 to 8 month period last year, up until the middle of March this year. And then when the story broke on the 6th of April, suddenly nothing has been posted. However, we now know that OG had a group of possibly up to 25 men and young boys, some of them under the age of 18, who were part of this online chat group. And the Washington Post has interviewed and filmed two of them. One of them, under the age of 18, with the permission of his mother, his identity, of course, is not being revealed. And he said that OG is fit, he's strong, he's armed, he's trained, he's a young, charismatic man who loves nature, God, shooting guns and racing cars. It gives you an idea of this chat group, which was formed a few years ago during the pandemic period, when maybe a lot of young people were trapped in their bedrooms and suddenly other things outside become more exciting. The Washington Post also looks at the type of character this person, believed to be a young man in his mid-20s, because obviously he does have access, first by text and then by photographs of classified documents. So he's worked on a military site, and that raises all kinds of questions. And also just how many photographs of classified documents are now circulating and what that means. That's why the Americans are obviously in a race against time to try and find out more about OG.
So what is the latest on the US investigation?
Well, the stories coming out of the United States is that the FBI and the Justice Department, who are conducting this investigation, they are close to finding out. There are several things that they'll be concerned about. If there are more than 300 photographs still circulating, many of them haven't been seen yet. News agencies across the globe have seen some documents yesterday and overnight, but there may be as many as 300. That'll be very worrying for them. How many people have access to classified documents, civilians and military, in these sites in the United States? And how easily then, if so many people do have access to classified documents, that they can actually share them, which OG is suspected of doing, if it is indeed him. Now, none of this has been verified or authenticated by the US government, which is why they are conducting this investigation as fast as they can. I think there's another element that they'll be very, very worried about, especially with the line about the United Nations today. They know that the Discord platform, where the social online group were chatting, that's been pulled, that information's been pulled, but still, who are the people who are part of this group? Half of them are thought to be outside the United States, and where did that information then, where was it spread to? Because the first photographs and the text were shown on the Telegram app, which is affiliated to Russia. Now, if there is a gaming app that's pulled these people together, then that will seriously concern the authorities, and not just in the United States.
Yolo, thank you very much. Our correspondent, Yolo Abdavith. China's Foreign Minister Qin Gang is in Uzbekistan on an official visit. He's taking part in a foreign ministers' meeting to discuss war-torn Afghanistan. Our correspondent Alyosha Milenkovic reports.
His foreign minister Qin Gang started with a meeting with three other colleagues. It was a meeting behind the closed doors with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and with foreign ministers of Pakistan and Iran. The topic was, of course, Afghanistan, because all of them are here because of the Afghanistan. The meeting behind the closed doors lasted around 45 minutes, and first to leave was Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. A little bit after that, he was followed by Iranian foreign minister, while Chinese and Pakistani foreign ministers stayed there for a little bit longer. After that, we had opportunity to hear Qin Gang at the press conference and his take on what is happening in Afghanistan, what needs to be done in Afghanistan, and what is China's position and China's vision of Afghanistan's future. And he said that China is very much aware of so many requests about the human rights that needs to be followed, about the rights of ethnic minorities, females' rights in Afghanistan, and that China is very interested all those standards to be met. But at this moment, as Qin Gang said, the most important thing is actually to feed Afghanis, because almost 2/3 of the country are hungry and the country is extremely poor. And maybe from the China's point of view, according to Qin Gang, the best thing would be, firstly, to attack the poverty in the country, and after that, when you address this, everything else can be addressed.
Russia's defense ministry says its troops in Bakhmut have blocked Ukrainian forces from either leaving or entering the city. The Moscow-backed Wagner mercenary group says it's now in control of 80% of Bakhmut, which has been at the centre of months of intense fighting. Kyiv rejects those claims. Elsewhere, the European Council has approved a new billion-dollar support package for member countries that have donated ammunition to Ukraine. Well, let's talk now to our correspondent Stuart Smith in Moscow. Stuart, what is Moscow saying about what it thinks is happening in Bakhmut?
Well, unusually, it is now giving an assessment of the situation specifically for that town. We've had general statements by the Russian Ministry of Defense talking about activities in the Donetsk direction, but over the past week it's been specifying what's going in Artemovsk, which is what they call Bakhmut here in Russia due to the old Soviet name. And they're saying that the Russian armed forces, in conjunction with the Wagner private military company, are in at least the centre of the city, trying to clear out what they call enemy forces, and indeed doing that together with Russian special forces. Now, it hasn't offered a percentage like Wagner has. Wagner says 80% of the city is cleared. The Russia-installed head of the Donetsk People's Republic says it's 75%, but clearly confidence is building here in Russia about progress in Bakhmut, although both the Russian Ministry of Defense and Wagner make it clear that so far the city is not fully under Russian control.
The EU has offered more support packages for countries who have donated and armed Ukraine. What's the latest on the Russian military effort?
Yeah, that's right. So that package was already agreed, but now there are the legal texts available, and it's a billion euros for specifically artillery ammunition, which we know Ukraine is lacking in getting through it very quickly. And so this would allow member states of the European Union to either redirect orders of ammunition to Ukraine or use their own stockpiles and, crucially, get money back from the European Union for it. Now, in terms of a Russian response of this compared to the other announcements from the EU and NATO over the past few months, doesn't compare. Certainly, Dmitry Peskov is unfazed. He was saying earlier today the degree of NATO involvement in the conflict, NATO specifically he was referring to, he says is going up. And while he said that delays progress, he, as he has so often done before, says that the positive aims of the so-called special military operation will not be affected. So not something that Moscow is concerned about.
Stuart, thank you for that. Our correspondent Stuart Smith in Moscow.
France is seeing another day of protests and strikes over President Macron's plans to make people work longer for their pensions. Demonstrations are taking place across the country, and luxury brand LVMH's headquarters was taken over by flare-carrying protesters in Paris. On Friday, France's highest court is expected to rule on whether or not the pension reforms are legal. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Ross Cullen in Paris. So, Ross, this is day 12 of action since January. What's happening today? Are the protests as big as they have been?
Well, Robin, you might be able to see some of the protesters behind me. They are on the streets outside the Bastille Opera House, one of the two major opera houses here in Paris. The protest today actually began at the other one, the more famous Opera Garnier. So it's been an opera-to-opera march, but they have certainly been singing and their voices throughout this protest. We have also seen a slight deterioration in the situation. We have got a lot of police here. The protesters are here. They've come to the end now of their march with all the main floats of the unions have dissipated up a street just to my left, but there are ranks of the gendarmes and police officers standing by, but also standing off at the moment, letting a lot of the protesters continue as they hope to try to fizzle out. There has been incidences here in this square over the last half hour of tear gas being used. We're in some sections to try to disperse some of the protesters, but at the moment it seems to be relatively calm. In terms of the numbers, Robin, 42,000 according to the police, 400,000 according to the unions.
So, Ross, tomorrow we're going to hear from France's highest court on whether these pension reforms are legal. What might happen, and will any ruling stop the protests?
Yeah, there are three rulings that could happen, Robin. A total approval of the pensions legislation by the Constitutional Council. That would mean that President Macron could sign the bill into law in its entirety. That's option one. Option two would be a partial approval, where some sections of the legislation are validated, others invalidated. President Macron could then sign into law those sections which have been approved. And then the final option is a total censure, when the Constitutional Council could say that the whole legislation should be culled and should be scrapped, and then that would force the government all the way back to square one, where we would have to start again by drawing up new legislation and bringing that before Parliament to restart that whole parliamentary Emmanuel Macron, the president, is going to be speaking early next week to address pensions reform and pensions protests more generally, and he has also said that he would be willing to speak to the unions. The unions say, we would like to discuss pension reform. If that's not on the table, we're not turning up. So at the moment, we are seeing this last day of social action before tomorrow, Friday, April the 14th, when we will have that crucial decision by the Constitutional Council.
Ross, for now, thank you very much. That's our correspondent, Ross Cullen, in Paris.
And you can get highlights from the week's news in Europe and China direct to your inbox from CGTN's storyboard email newsletter. Sign up at europe.cgtn.com/newsletter.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. The number of people filing for unemployment benefits in the United States has reached its highest level in over a year. We're on Wall Street next.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you. All around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
What do we mean when we talk about the difference?
Brazen axe.
The difference is in the detail, in the background,
Defense ministers from
the wider angle and perspective of every story. Wherever the story may be. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Brazil is back, so says President Lula da Silva as he tours the Chinese financial hub of Shanghai during his state visit.
Our other headlines, China's exports unexpectedly rose last month, shooting up almost 15% from a year ago.
And pensions protests in Paris. Another day of strikes across France. Luxury brand LVMH is targeted by demonstrators.
The usually rather dry monthly report by OPEC is attracting more attention than usual. That's because the oil producer group shocked the market last month by announcing a surprise cut in production, despite growing energy demand. Our correspondent Johannes Pleshberger reports now from Vienna.
Analysts expected that OPEC would shed light on shock output target cuts announced earlier this month. The producer group flagged downside risks to summer oil demand, but maintained its forecast for global oil demand growth in 2023. It says demand will rise by 2.3 million barrels per day. Experts believe OPEC Plus wants to defend the price floor they are comfortable with. With success, crude oil, which rose past $80 per barrel, could soon reach the $100 mark. US President Joe Biden has downplayed the impact of the surprise cuts, but the OPEC move could complicate US efforts to tame nagging inflation and dampen gasoline prices at home. Analysts say the higher prices could spell more income for OPEC ally Russia. Moscow did confirm that declining output aims to keep prices on a certain level. However, some experts don't believe that the cuts will be as high as announced. Instead of the 2.3 million barrels per day cut, underproduction by Russia and Saudi Arabia could lead to a far smaller decrease of only 600,000 barrels. Johannes Peschberger, CGTN, Vienna.
The number of people filing for unemployment benefits in the United States has reached its highest level in over a year. It comes after US inflation fell to 5% in March, the lowest level in 2 years. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, John Terrett in New York. So, John, what's happened to the optimism of yesterday?
Oh, my goodness me, Robin and Jamie, I don't know. Yesterday we were cock-a-hoop here, weren't we, about everything. It was such good news that the CPI had come in more or less where we thought it would be, and it was better than expected in many respects. And it's been a real roller coaster. Let me tell you, so CPI, consumer price inflation, okay, this is what Americans pay each month and each year more in the stores and the gas stations. So yesterday comes in at the slowest pace for 2 years. That's very good. We're at 5% now, down from 9% in June of last year. The core was a little bit higher, though. Strip out food and energy, and it wasn't quite so good. And it dawned on investors during the afternoon that actually prices still remain pretty elevated, and gas is going to go up because of the story that we just heard. The Saudis and the other OPEC members cutting oil production in May by more than 1 million barrels of oil a day. That's going to push up gasoline prices here, and that is a major factor of inflation. And then came the Federal Reserve minutes. And here, this was unexpected. It was unprecedented. It was anything with an "un" before it that you can think of, quite frankly. We've never seen this before. Now, the minutes come out a couple of weeks after the last meeting, which was in the middle of March. And there are two things that you really don't mention when you are a politician or you work for them. One is you never talk about wanting to have a weaker dollar. No, 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 it's always a strong dollar, always a strong dollar, even if secretly you want the dollar to be weaker. And you never talk about the R word, recession. And they did. And it shocked everybody, because basically what they said was, this is the staff briefing members of the FOMC committee. We think there's going to be a mild recession because of the banking crisis, which I've told you before, it really has still not quite gone away. Now, they also said that the US economy would recover strongly in 2024 and 2025. Inflation would step down this year and slow down sharply in 2024. They also recommended a 50 basis point increase back in March, and the committee members ignored them and gave them only a 25 basis point increase because of the banking crisis. So the market sold off yesterday. The Dow had been up by 200 points. It closed down 38 points. And then this morning, Thursday, we get PPI, which is son or daughter, whichever you like, of CPI. It's not quite as glamorous. This is wholesale inflation, paid by the people that make the things that we then buy in the stores. And it came in much better than expected. It was down 0.5% in March. If you strip out food and energy, it was down 0.1%, whereas economists had thought it might be up by 0.2%. And that, plus the jobless story that you mentioned before I came on, means that now the markets are all happy again. They're all going around slapping each other on the back and congratulating each other again. And the Dow is up 211 points. The NASDAQ doing really well, because techs benefit from this sort of stuff, is up almost 200 points itself, and the S&P 500 is ahead by 33 points. So what a 24 hours it's been here.
So, John, we have 2 annual spring meetings underway from the World Bank and also the International Monetary Fund. What are the highlights?
Yes. Well, I have about 3 new words that I've never really used when reporting this IMF World Bank spring meeting before. One of them is slow down, and the other one is uncertainty. And those two words have literally dominated this meeting, which happens pretty much every year. The Chinese have turned up, by the way, for the first time in about 3 years because of COVID, and people are pretty happy to see the delegation there. But it's not been a great week, I'm afraid, and the global economic outlook and the global financial stability report, which the IMF turned out on Tuesday, makes for very tough reading. And my highlights are the UK faring worse this year than Russia, for goodness sake, with all those sanctions against it. The US economy growing by 1.6% this year and 1.1% next year. That is a highlight, believe it or not, but it's actually not very good. Global growth, 2.8% this year, 3% for the next 5. And China and India being highlighted as two real success stories. China really coming out of COVID very nicely now, and China and India responsible for half of all the global growth in the foreseeable forecast. But then there's another word that the IMF used, and that word is turbulence. And turbulence is associated with the banking crisis, which I'll say again, I don't think has completely gone away. This is off the back of Credit Suisse being taken over by UBS in Europe, and here the regional banking crisis. And finally, today, Kristalina Georgieva, who is the managing director of the IMF, has been speaking. She's called for more support for poor nations. She says the IMF has put in $24 billion since the start of COVID to try to help them, but higher interest rates, which we've just been talking about, have increased the cost of borrowing, and she says, therefore, increased the funding gap. And she's called on rich nations who, despite everything, remain very, very rich. You know, you've got to remember that. These nations are at the top of the table, are very, very rich. And she's saying that, you know, you could, pointing the finger and saying you could really do a lot more to support those nations, many of them in Africa, which are really struggling.
John, thanks very much for that. Our correspondent John Terretts in New York.
The UK economy flatlined in February with no growth in GDP. The Office for National Statistics says public sector strikes in England and low energy consumption offset growth in areas such as construction, which grew 2.4%. But the government says the outlook is brighter than expected, with the UK now set to avoid recession later this year.
Defunct crypto exchange FTX has recovered more than $7 billion in assets. That's an increase of $800 million since January. The company's attorney says it's negotiating with stakeholders about options for restarting its crypto exchange. FTX collapsed in November last year. Its founder, Sam Bankman-Fried, was arrested and charged with fraud.
Twitter has partnered with the investment platform eToro, providing a new feature for all its users to buy and sell stock as well as other financial assets. It's the latest move as part of plans by CEO Elon Musk to turn Twitter into a financial super app. eToro is an online brokerage founded in Israel in 2007. It allows users to buy and sell stocks, cryptocurrencies, and index funds. The International Monetary Fund's efforts to get poorer countries to spend more on looking after their populations are backfiring. The findings of a report by Oxfam, which has called the lenders' approach incoherent and inadequate. The IMF's social spending floors were set up in 2019, aimed at getting countries in receipt of loans to protect minimum levels of funding in areas like health and education, and to raise that spending by around $1 billion within the second year of the loan.
But Oxfam says that for every extra dollar the IMF asks those countries to spend, it's required most of them to cut 4 times more through austerity measures.
Well, the report looked at all IMF loan programmes agreed with 17 low and middle-income countries in 2020 and 2021. It found inconsistencies, a lack of transparency in tracking progress, inadequate target setting and inflation being ignored when reporting data.
Crucially, the report found that more than a third of social spending targets weren't even implemented, while at the same time countries did manage to hit 85% of the IMF's targets for balancing budgets, often through cuts to public spending, the very thing that the IMF was hoping to protect.
Nabil Abdo is Senior Policy Advisor on International Financial Institutions at Oxfam International. Nabil Abdo, welcome. This policy was intended to protect social spending, but, I mean, frankly, it has gone bang. It's backfired. What do you think has gone wrong?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Well, what's gone wrong is what has been wrong for a long time, is that it's clear that the IMF prioritizes austerity, public spending cuts over social protection, education, over spending on social protection, education, and health. I mean, like you mentioned, the numbers, countries are implementing more austerity measures. I mean, there is a simple reason for that, is when countries fail to meet their social spending targets, their targets on education, health, social protection, the loan will continue as normal. However, when they fail to meet their austerity targets, the loan will be suspended. So the IMF is prioritizing harmful austerity over supporting countries in building their social spending, in building their education and health, and reaching sustainable development goals. And this comes on the back of the pandemic, where the IMF has been talking about needing to build back better and the lessons learned, etc. And we see that now nothing has been learned, and we are repeating the same mistakes of the past.
Is one of the problems, or another of the problems, having spending conditions, prescriptive conditions, attached to IMF loans like this?
Yeah, I mean, there is this problem. The problem, I mean, the biggest problem is that the austerity cost, harmful austerity, has been the default policy for the IMF in its loan programs. And this austerity, this harmful austerity, is about this kind of requirements and all of that. But the problem is that austerity has failed, austerity kills, austerity stunts lives, and there are alternatives. There are real alternatives to austerity that the IMF is failing to recommend countries and to ask countries to implement them, like progressive measures, progressive taxation, wealth taxes, etc. So we have a lot of alternatives, but the IMF is always turning the blind eye. And we found, I mean, we call the report social spending floors a fig leaf for austerity, is because we think that social spending, these floors are being used by the IMF in order to deflect attention away from any discussion on its austerity framework or its austerity policies. And we think the countries need to have a breathing space. They need to have the decision-making in order for them to implement the policies that are best to protect their people, especially in these times of crisis and in these times where these crises for most low-income countries is imported, is not their fault. It's because of everything happening, like the war in Ukraine, the cost of living crisis, the inflation, and all of that, while countries are being asked to solve international economic issues, problems with domestic policies through making the most vulnerable pay the price.
Oxfam has talked of what it calls a lost decade of development. I mean, what is the implication for countries like Afghanistan, Bangladesh, if they do not get the international funding that they need?
Well, I mean, the consequences are dire, of course. These countries, many countries, need a lot of funding. And the IMF itself has said that over 60%, 2/3 of low-income countries are either in debt distress or close to that distress. And due to interest rate hikes in rich countries, the borrowing cost of countries and the borrowing cost is increasing and sucking away vital spending for health, education, and social protection. The IMF and the international community, not only the IMF, the international community, wealthy countries, have a responsibility to support countries in terms of grants, in terms of concessional lending, in order for them to be able to support their population and not attach this kind of support with harmful austerity that really cripples countries, that depresses their growth. And even the IMF 2 days ago in their World Economic Outlook, they even admitted that for the past decade, austerity hasn't worked, yet they keep pushing on it. They keep pushing it in low-income countries and in poor countries. And this needs to stop immediately. And the IMF needs to have alternatives. The IMF needs to help countries in achieving their SDGs. They need to help countries. These floors need to be an instrument for income redistribution, for wealth redistribution, and reduce inequalities. And as I said, the austerity framework should not be...
We'll have to stop it there, I'm afraid. We're out of time, but good to see you, and thank you for your contribution. Nabil Abdou from Oxfam International in Washington.
Thank you.
South Korea and Canada are set to hold talks about an information security agreement. According to a Canadian government source, the proposed deal would allow intelligence sharing and promote security ties. Canada announced talks on a similar agreement with Japan last year.
Norway says it's expelling 15 officials from the Russian embassy in Oslo over spying claims. It says the group are intelligence officers who are operating as diplomats. Their removal cuts the number of embassy staff in Oslo by a third. Moscow says it plans to respond, but has given no details.
The DPRK has reportedly launched a new type of ballistic missile. South Korea says it flew about 1,000 kilometres and appeared to be a new weapon displayed at recent military parades and possibly used solid fuel. Solid fuel missiles can be ready for launch faster than liquid-powered models because they're fueled at the point of manufacture. The launch triggered a missile warning in Japan, with residents told to take cover.
Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny is unwell with what his representatives say might be signs of poisoning. It's claimed that Navalny, who's being held in a prison outside Moscow, has been suffering from a stomach complaint and has lost a substantial amount of weight. His spokeswoman has said he's possibly being poisoned slowly to attract less attention. The Kremlin hasn't commented, saying it's a matter for the prison authorities.
Ghana has become the first country in the world to approve a new malaria vaccine from Oxford University that's been described as a world changer. The mosquito-borne disease kills more than 600,000 people each year, most of them children in Africa. Trial data showed that the R21 vaccine was up to 80% effective when given as 3 initial doses. Ghana has cleared its use for children under the age of 3.
Japan's government says it remains committed to its plan to release wastewater from the Fukushima nuclear power station into the sea. The move, which is set to begin later this year, has sparked international condemnation with protests at home and abroad. But officials insist the water will be properly treated and poses no threat. Our correspondent Terence Tamashima reports now from Tokyo.
Protests like these have been held in different parts of Japan since the government announced its plan to release radioactive wastewater from Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant into the ocean 2 years ago. Japan's government and the Tokyo Electric Company says the radioactive water will be treated to safe levels before it is discharged into the Pacific Ocean. TEPCO says the water is being diluted to reduce the radioactivity of the hydrogen compound tritium to 1,500 becquerel per litre, which is well below the national safety standard.
Even if they discharge the contaminated water into the sea now, more and more of this water will accumulate over the years to come. Unless we see prospects of completing the decommissioning, it will be an endless cycle.
There's no certainty that the treated wastewater is truly harmless. If there's the slightest possibility of danger, we have to deal with it. With these thoughts, I don't want to go back to my home in Fukushima just yet.
However, more than 1 million tons of the treated water is being stored at the site of the Fukushima facility, which was severely damaged by an earthquake and tsunami over a decade ago.
Oceans are connected, and I'm afraid we will disperse the radiation to all corners of the globe. They said they will dilute the wastewater to a safe level, but if you continue to discharge such water, I am afraid radiation will spread all over the world.
The release of the wastewater has prompted environmental concerns, including about the potential effect on the fishing industry. Protesters say they're worried about the possible long-term impact on environment and marine life, not only along the coast of Japan, but in the international waters too. Terence Tamashima, CGTN, Tokyo.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. The woman who popularised the miniskirt, Mary Quant, has died at the age of 93. We'll be looking back at her life.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw.
The clean-up operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
Far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So into the attention of world leaders.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country.
There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew.
And in these mountains, they recently finished building a power plant.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. The fashion designer Mary Quant, often credited with popularising the miniskirt that helped define Britain's swinging 60s, has died at the age of 93.
Self-taught designer who transformed a small cottage industry into a commercial and cultural powerhouse was not just a fashion legend, but also a phenomenal businesswoman. Well, let's talk now to Dana Thomas, who's a fashion journalist and author. Good to see Dana. So, how can you sum this up? But what is Mary Quant's contribution to the world of fashion, would you say?
Well, she brought women freedom from the new look being Christian Dior's look from the 1940s and 50s of cinched waists and heavy skirts and heavy clothes that weighed women down and made feminism pretty much impossible. So she freed us from crinoline skirts and twin sets and gave us mini skirts, and her rallying cry was modern youth, that she was the beginning of when women started looking like young women, and young women looked like young women rather than looking like their mothers or dressing like their mothers. Her wash and wear haircut got rid, instead of the bouffant, her mini skirts instead of big full skirts, her soft clothes, and her really cool go-go boots.
And this was really groundbreaking at the time, wasn't it? But also faced some opposition.
It did face opposition. It was, it was radical in part because it was completely the opposite of what everybody had been wearing. I mean, you think about Audrey Hepburn in Breakfast at Tiffany's, that was the look, the Jackie Kennedy look. And Mary Quant was doing the exact opposite. And in fact, there was a very famous moment in Washington, D.C., where Joan Kennedy, the sister-in-law of Jackie Kennedy, showed up in the White House in one of these Mary Quant, I don't know if it was Mary Quant herself, but inspired miniskirt suits or dresses. And it caused quite a scandal in Washington at the time because women weren't supposed to be showing off their legs, and certainly not to that level of just derriere skimming with these groovy boots that came up to your knees. It was very sort of Goldie Hawn, go-go, flower power, love child clothing.
So she popularised the miniskirt, also hot pants and skinny ribbed jumpers. But she reached beyond the world of fashion, didn't she? She was also influential in wider culture in the 60s and beyond.
Well, absolutely. She was one of the first who really went into spinning out her business in all these different directions. Again, something that Christian Dior had started by doing like hosiery and a few other lines, but she wound up doing Mary Quant makeup and Mary Quant bed linens and Mary Quant everything. And it's funny because looking at the figures, she grew her company to $20 million a year in sales, which at the time was enormous. Now we have $10 billion a year. Christian Dior and Louis Vuitton and Chanel do, billions and billions in sales in Gucci. So, but at the time it felt like a lot. And she was also a trailblazing businesswoman at a time when women were not doing this. The only other one out there was Coco Chanel.
So a groundbreaking designer, a trailblazing businesswoman. What will she be remembered for, though, do you think? What will her legacy be?
I think her legacy will be that she was the one who interpreted in fashion what was happening in the swinging 60s in London, which was a serious movement. She was thought of when she went to America as the fifth Beatle. And I think that that's a really fair assessment of her, that she really did interpret through clothing what the Beatles were doing through music, what artists like Hockney were doing in painting. It was of its moment, and when you look at it, you understand exactly what the culture was and what the zeitgeist was at that time.
Dana, good to talk to you. Thank you for joining us. That's Dana Thomas, the fashion journalist and author.
Small businesses in Hungary are struggling to stay afloat. The country is in recession with the highest inflation in the European Union and rising unemployment. Our correspondent Pablo Gutierrez reports.
Sosa Feher knows her family's business is in the red. Hungary's rising inflation, the government's price caps on essential food items, and the energy crisis have squeezed all of their profits.
We will have to close at some point. Right now, we don't have enough profits to cover the expenses. This month, we barely made rent, and bills are piling up.
Feher's family store is located on Rákóczi Street, one of the main thoroughfares in Budapest. Just a couple of years ago, this avenue symbolized revival and gentrification in the capital. But that's all changed.
Many shops here are bankrupt. Others make small profit margins. It's terrible.
Despite the grim economic prospects, the government here insists the economy is strengthening. However, economists warn that looking only at the GDP and ignoring other economic indicators does not paint a realistic picture of Hungary's financial health.
The Hungarian figures are a bit misleading, since the GDP is not the national income. It incorporates the profits of foreign businesses. And in Hungary, German car manufacturers, for instance, contribute to GDP, some to the employment, to profitability, but it's not national income. National income is the pay you earn and the local profit that Hungarian businesses make.
And businesses are struggling to survive. According to the Hungarian Trade Association, there are currently 109,000 registered businesses in Hungary. The group expects around 4,000 to close by the end of this year.
Small businesses in Hungary employ about 2/3 of the country's population. So economists say that a wave of shop closures will drive job losses. The current unemployment rate in Hungary is 4%, the highest it's been in the past 2 years.
Hungary's inflation year on year is 25%, and food inflation is 50%. Productivity has slowed, and the nation's budget deficit has ballooned. Many economists and business owners say the government's take on the situation does not match the reality on the streets.
So if the inflation is so high in Hungary, probably the highest in Europe at the moment, how can the economy grow?
And as Feher tallies up her losses and counts the days until she has to pay rent, she worries that soon her store will look like many others on Rákóczi Street, boarded up and abandoned. Pablo Gutierrez, CGTN, Budapest.
The headlines again. Brazil is back, so says its President Lula da Silva as he tours the Chinese financial hub of Shanghai during his state visit to the country.
Our other headlines, China's exports unexpectedly rise last month, shooting up almost 15% from this time last year.
And pensions protests in Paris, another day of strikes across France. Luxury brand LVMH is targeted by demonstrators.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
There's more on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com. And do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. And you can go to CGTN Europe's channel on the Telegram app or scan the QR code on the screen to get stories and updates sent direct to your phone.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all of the team in London, it's goodbye.
Goodbye.